Hi, I'm Juan Camilo Estrada and welcome to Epicenter. Did you know that the cryopreservation is a method by which we can preserve a cell by pausing the metabolic process without damaging its integrity and have it as stable as possible so that when it thaws, it has all its vitality and functionality? Today we will have as an expert Santiago Titiribi, veterinarian specialized in animal reproduction biotechnology, who will explain to us about cryoprotectants and their freezing methods, focusing mainly on vitrification. There are two methods, slow freezing and fast freezing. The first one is known as a process where basically some freezing programmers are used, which are machines that basically go to the freezing process, gradually lowering the temperature of the structures, whether embryos, oocytes, or spermatozoa, and what it seeks is that this temperature does not drop so abruptly in the cell, but is more programmable. While vitrification is an ultra-rapid freezing method, it is an ultra-rapid freezing where basically the cell goes from 37 or 22 degrees, while the process is being done, to 196 degrees. So it is a process that seeks, through cryoprotectants, to cause the cell withstand the freezing process.
Muy bien.
Very well. We already know that there are two methods of embryo freezing, fast freezing and slow freezing. Now let's know what is the general process used by embryos when vitrified. Embryo vitrification consists of obtaining the embryo. We normally obtain an embryo from a donor mare's washing. Basically what we do is to keep it in a maintenance substance, and then we will subject it to different degrees or concentrations of cryoprotectants. So basically we use wells through which the embryos pass. What these wells do is to generate osmotic and cellular changes in the embryo. That's why it will dehydrate. And as this process advances, these concentrations of cryoprotectants through which these wells pass make them occupy the place of the cell and will protect the cell so that it resists the process of cellular freezing.
Proteger a la célula para que resista como tal el proceso de la congelación celular.
The objective of cryoprotectant inside the cell is to make the liquid denser in order to reach a state of vitriol or glass. For this reason, it is called vitrification. Let's now know the advantages of rapid freezing or vitrification. The advantage of fast freezing or vitrification is that in less time it achieves the freezing of a cell, while slow freezing takes me much more time to do it. Another disadvantage of slow freezing is that the cost of freezing programmers are suddenly higher. On the other hand, when we do vitrification, we reduce cost and time a little bit. It is a process that requires the use of cryoprotectants, which is something that can be limiting when these cryoprotectants become toxic in the cell. So you are going to have a problem of cell toxicity that will affect cell maintenance. But we are looking for, with vitrification, and with the studies and research that are done on the subject, that each time these cryoprotectants achieve the best results, less toxicity and better pregnancy rates than what we are looking for after thawing these embryos. As Santiago mentions, vitrification benefits pregnancy rates. In Colombia, embryo transfer opens up the number of offspring obtained per year. Let's see why. In Colombia today, embryo transfer is gaining great strength. Some decades ago, this biotechnology arrived in Colombia, and today I think it is one of the biotechnologies that are most used in breeding farms because it is the best way I have to increase the number of offspring per year of mares with an important genetic value. In those mares that we also have some illusions. Many times when they are animals that come from important breeds, embryo transfer is performed, so it is a technique that is being widely used, which is gaining much more strength. Nowadays, almost all the breeders are using this biotechnology to reproduce their mares, and what this achieves is to be able to reproduce animals in competition, to reproduce animals with some reproductive problems or already very advanced ages, so that soon these steps cannot be given properly in them. That is to say, it opens at the number of offspring that we can obtain per year from these animals. We are already understanding what the quick freezing or vitrification method consists of and its impact in Colombia. In a moment, we will continue learning more about this method and the importance of the recipient mares to obtain the embryo. Embryo transfer is an assisted reproduction technique in which a veterinarian extracts an embryo from a donor mare, the biological mother, and implants in it in a recipient mare. The latter is the one that gestations, fowls, makes a fowl be born from the verb parir and suckles a fowl. That is why she is also called a carrier. Let's see the importance of having the recipients in good conditions. The issue of the recipients in embryo transfer is very important because the recipient is the mare that will receive the embryos from the donor mares. It is commonly said, and many texts talk about that more or less in an embryo transfer, a donor mare must have at least 3 recipient mares. This is a limitation many times for some breeding farms or reproduction centers, because obviously this increases the costs, makes the whole issue of maintenance of these animals more expensive, and sometimes the spaces are limited. So having a lot of recipient nowadays is also becoming a problem for the breeding farms. The recipients need to be almost synchronized with the donor mares because they are where the embryo will enter. The maternal recognition will take place and the whole process of implementation, gestation, and all the placental structures will be formed. Therefore, we need that the recipient has very good conditions. So first of all, they must be synchronized with respect to the donor, that is to say, in the cycles, and also that the animals must be in a good bodily and nutritional conditions, which sometimes is also something that limits a little the quality of these recipients. Having recipients in optimal conditions greatly improves the transfer processes, but when there are no recipients in good conditions, we can opt for other methods such as embryo cryopreservation. But how are the recipients evaluated to ensure that they are in good conditions? The recipients basically go through some follow-ups, reproductive follow-ups, and reproductive checkups are done where their structures are evaluated, uterus, ovaries, among others. When they already have a synchrony with the donor, the ovulations are programmed to coincide with the ovulations of the donors, and after the embryo washing, we have the recipient with a structure that we call corpus luteum, which is the one that produces progesterone, and we can transfer the embryo. That is basically what we do in this recipient programming. Besides that, they must comply with certain conditions such as age. They must be of a certain age. They must not be very adult animals because the uterus is already losing its capacity to carry these pregnancies to term. And they must also be animals with a maternal ability, so to speak, that they have the capacity to carry those embryos to the end of lactation. Once we know the importance of the recipient, let's see how to wash the mare, a very important process to acquire the embryos.
Entonces, el lavado de embriones.
Embryo washing is basically a technique that seeks a mare that was previously inseminated or that was serviced by a breeder. In that area, we have to be clear about the day of ovulation, and when we have this information defined, 7 or 8 days after the ovulation process, we are going to do the washing. What does the lavage consist of? We pass a probe through the cervix that is inside the uterus,
Cervix, que está dentro del útero, y a través de...
and through this probe, we are going to perform a lavage through which a solution that fills the uterus enters, and after this process, we are going to evacuate this liquid that is going to reach a container that has a filter. What is the purpose of this filter? To retain embryos or structures larger than 100 microns and to allow all liquids to pass through.
Todos los líquidos. Una vez ya...
Once we obtain the wash, we take the filter to the stereoscope, where we are going to search for and identify the embryo. Sometimes the embryos are visible, sometimes they are not very visible, depending on the microns of the embryo and the days or better stage in which it is. We make a search with a stereoscope, and the idea is to make an exhaustive search. What I normally do is that many times I pass the search medium to a container that has the marks, and so it is much easier for me to do the search here.
Me queda mucho más fácil hacer la búsqueda acá.
Here we see how it passes the liquid to the other container. Then with the help of a syringe, it washes again any surplus that is in the first container to avoid embryos remaining there. Once this process is finished, it is passed to the stereoscope, placing the container very well for observation and search of the embryo. Did you know that the size of the embryo has to do with the effectiveness of vitrification? It is said that the embryos smaller than 300 microns have more resistance to the process, while those larger than 300 microns could have some difficulties. Nowadays, some countries more advanced in this technology, such as the United States, Brazil, and some European countries, are performing micromanipulation of the embryos, helping the cyroprotectants to penetrate more easily. For this reason, the embryo size does not benefit the process. Once we have identified the embryo, we must have at hand an embryo washing medium that will basically help us to make the embryo have a better viability to remove the detritus with which it comes from the washing or from the uterus. We are going to make some passages through these different drops so that the embryo obviously has a better viability. What we do is that through a straw, in this case one of 0.25, which will depend on the size of the embryo. If it is a larger embryo, we use straws of 0.5. What we are going to do is that we are going to take a small amount of the medium from the first drop, and we come for our embryo. We deposit it in the first drop, and we are going to make a passage through all the drops until finishing in the drop in the center, which is where we are going to pack the embryo.
Hasta finalizar en la gota del centro, que es donde vamos ya a empacar como tal el embrión.
An important fact to mention is to know the main damages that an embryo has in the process. One of them is the formation of ice crystals that could damage the vitrified cells. For this reason, cyroprotective substances are used to avoid it. Very severe osmotic changes can also occur, causing these cells to dehydrate drastically and no longer have the ability to expand. To better understand how the freezing process is performed, let's know for Santiago the two types of freezing, a slow one and a fast one, known as vitrification. What we basically do is that the embryo is already here in this first well and must go through each one of the wells because in these wells there are different concentrations of cyroprotectants. As I was saying, there are permeable and non-permeable cyroprotectants. Some commonly used permeable cyroprotectants are ethylene glycol, dimethyl sulfoxide, and other non-permeable cyroprotectants, which are some sugars such as sucrose that also help to take the liquid out of the cell so that the cyroprotectant can penetrate. Then what we do is to pass the embryo through each of these wells, where it will acquire different concentrations of cyroprotectant and a different exposure time. Once the process is finished, and when I go to the last well, normally here in the handling of the embryos is somewhat complicated because these substances are very dense and normally the embryos do not go to the bottom but float. though sometimes it is the most complicated part of the vitrification process. We take the embryo, we take it to the last well, and between the last well and the transfer to the assembly that is already done in a straw, very similar to the ones we used. There can be different systems. Elongated straws, syrotops, it is already mounted in a straw and basically taken directly to the liquid nitrogen. The other method that we also use in the laboratory is slow freezing, different from the vitrification process. Slow freezing basically requires this equipment, which is a programmable freezer. This is an embryo freezer, and basically we deposit the embryo in these spaces that the freezer has, and we will program the system to make a gradual decrease of the temperature. This will generate a cold curve, and this cold curve will favor the freezing process to avoid further damage to the cell. Then it will take a cold curve that normally goes almost to 30 degrees Celsius, which is the most critical phase, and from there it can go directly to liquid nitrogen. Let's remember that with either of these types of freezing, the embryos completely stop the cellular metabolism, preserving them for many years, but once thawed, the embryos are ready to be transferred to the recipient mares. Now let's learn about a case of effective embryo transfer and how the pregnancy has developed. What we always do for the embryo transfer is to make sure that both the donor and the recipient are in sync.
Estén como en una sincronía. La idea es que la donadora.
The idea is that the donor has a follicle, which we are going to determine by ultrasound. We are going to follow up that follicle, and when we have a follicle of good size, what we do is inseminate, and after this, in the same ultrasound, we detect ovulation, and in the recipient, we look for the same thing, that is, to look for follicles so that they are also ovulated, and that those follicles and the gluteal bodies that are formed after the follicles are the ones that sustain the pregnancy once we pass the embryos. What we always do is to synchronize both donor and donor recipients through follow-up ultrasound. Once we transfer the embryos, what we look for in the uterus is to detect those embryos that are indicating a pregnancy. Then, once the embryos are thawed or the fresh embryos are transferred, what we always hope to obtain is that we see a pregnancy as such or a positive pregnancy. In this case, we are reviewing a mare that was transferred a few days ago, and here we have an embryo. This is the embryo obtained, and it is already forming in the uterus. This embryo is approximately 28 days or a month after being transferred. It is already in the process of growth, and this will be the mare that will be in charge of the whole process of gestation and lactation as such of the embryo. This process of embryo transfer and vitrification must be carried out by experts in the field for its results to be effective. Finally, Santiago tells us and recommends why it is important to cryopreserve embryos. In addition to this, I can use young mares with potential.
¿Por qué sería bueno hacer criopreservación de embriones?
What would it be good to cryopreserve embryos? We know that the cryopreservation has been used in other cells, such as spermatozoa or semen, which opens a possibility for breeders to use semen as an export product. For this reason, there are genetic banks, and we market this semen to other countries where we have a very important boom in our Criollo horse.
Eso hace que tengamos la posibilidad de sacar este material.
And this gives us the possibility to obtain this material. The embryos would also gain importance there to be able to be exported and import embryos from other countries, and obviously to be able to obtain and sell genetics to other parts of the world, and that is an important advantage of cryopreservation. Another important advantage of cryopreservation is that we separate the embryo transfer from the washing, that is, if I have a mare washed, I don't have to limit myself to having a recipient in good conditions or synchronized because I can do the washing at the moment, and if I don't have the recipient, I can freeze these embryos and later when I have a recipient in good conditions, I can transfer these embryos. This is another important advantage of the technique.
Esto, pues digamos que puedo utilizar yeguas jóvenes.
That is to say, animals that have expectations or an important potential. I can begin to wash these animals. I can freeze and save those embryos, so that later that animal, if it shows me good conditions in the sporting part and ability in its descendants, I can obtain these embryos to be transferred to recipients later on.
Transferidos a receptoras posteriormente. En Colombia esta técnica aún está como haciendo sus primeros.
In Colombia, this technique is still making its first advances. Because some laboratories are doing it, some people are doing it, but it is not a technique that is fully expanded throughout the country. I think it is a technique that in the future, in a few years, is going to dominate a little bit the subject of biotechnologies, because the more research is done on the subject and the search for new cyroprotectants, new substances that promote and improve the development of the embryos, it is going to become much more important. Little by little, we are coming to the end of our program in Epicentro, but first we are going to share with you the pictures and videos that you send us to our email epicentrotvagro@gmail.com. This is our section Closer to the Field. Juan's Farm on Instagram with a numeral Closer to the Field TV sends us this reel where we can see several pictures of his banana crop. Viviana Quintero shares with us 3 photographs, this one in particular of some moritas, the next one of a spectacular flower, and this one of a tree that gives a lot of life to our air. Also, the farm, La Bendición, through Instagram, with the numeral Closer to the Field, shares this reel with some important facts and reflections about cow's milk and tells us milk is a complete and balanced food that has all the nutritional principles that the body requires to grow and maintain health. And thank you very much for your participation. Always remember to send us your comments, your videos, your pictures to our email epicentrotvagro@gmail.com so that we can include them in our program. So we end this new Epicenter program to you who are always with us and behind your screens. Thank you very much. What we always do is to synchronize both donor and donor recipients through follow-up ultrasound. Once we transfer the embryos, what we look for in the uterus is to detect those embryos that are indicating a pregnancy. Then, once the embryos are thawed or the fresh embryos are transferred, what we always hope to obtain is that we see a pregnancy as such or a positive pregnancy. In this case, we are reviewing a mare that was transferred a few days ago, and here we have an embryo. This is the embryo obtained, and it is already forming in the uterus. This embryo is approximately 28 days or a month after being transferred. It is already in the process of growth, and this will be the mare that will be in charge of the whole process of gestation and lactation as such of the embryo. This process of embryo transfer and vitrification must be carried out by experts in the field for its results to be effective. Finally, Santiago tells us and recommends why it is important to cryopreserve embryos. In addition to this, I can use young mares with potential. That is to say, animals that have expectations or an important potential. I can begin to wash these animals. I can freeze and save those embryos, so that later that animal, if it shows me good conditions in the sporting part and ability in its descendants, I can obtain these embryos to be transferred to recipients later on.